Hey, what's up guys? My name's Joel from Easy Engineering and welcome back to another video. Now today I wanted to talk about one of my favorite subjects in mixing, and that's compression. Now compression can be one of the most useful tools in a mix engineer's arsenal if used correctly. It might seem like a simple thing to get your head around, but it can actually take a really long time. So without further delay, let's get right into the video. So put simply, compression deals with dynamics. Now the way dynamics was explained to me was, if you think about classical music and how there's really loud sections and there's really quiet sections, and the difference between the two is quite large. This means that it has a very large dynamic range. Whereas in electronic music, the difference between the loud bits and the quiet bits is actually quite small, which means it has a smaller dynamic range. Now, before you start compressing and just whacking a compressor on every channel, you need to try and understand what you're trying to accomplish. You also need to understand the parameters of the compressor, you need to understand the types of compression that you get, and also the various techniques used in compression. Now, there are 5 main parameters that you'll find on pretty much every compressor out there, and this is the attack time, the release time, the threshold, the ratio, and the knee. These might vary from compressor to compressor, but you will find them on there. So looking at these parameters in detail, the attack time tells the compressor how fast or how slow to react to the incoming signal. The release time tells the compressor how long to stay active for and compress the signal. And the ratio is basically how much compression is applied. The higher the ratio, the more the signal will get compressed and the less of the signal will get passed through. Usually a 10:1 ratio or higher is considered limiting, which means that none of the signal will get passed through a certain threshold. Now a threshold is basically telling the compressor at what level to start working. If you put a threshold at -16 dB, the compressor will only start working once the signal reaches and passes through -16 dB. Now there's also something called the knee, which is basically determining how the compression is applied. The harder the knee, the harder the compression in relation to the ratio. Now there are a few other parameters that you will find on a compressor, such as the input and output gain control. These increase or decrease either the incoming signal or the output signal once it's passed through the compressor. A good rule of thumb is to increase the output by the amount of compression applied. This is done in order to maintain something known as equal listening level. This is one of the key elements in producing a high quality mix, and this is something that I will actually talk about in a further video. Lastly, there is the dry and wet gain control. This is essentially indicating how much of the wet signal of the compressor will be applied. When using a compressor, there's a few things that you need to consider, and one of the most important things to consider is the actual sound's transients, because this is essentially what you will be affecting the most when compressing. So when compressing, you need to understand the overall result that you're aiming to achieve. Are you trying to tame these transients? Are you trying to reduce the dynamic range? Are you trying to control a certain frequency range, which is multiband compression? Or are you trying to tighten up the sound? It's really important that you try and not overcompress. I used to do this for years, and it just ends up making your music sound lifeless, and it makes it feel like your music has no room to breathe. This is why I love compression so much, because it has the ability to give life to your music or take it away. Now there are 4 main types of compressors that you will find, the first being tube compression. This is probably the oldest compression out there, and tube compressors tend to have a slower response. Because the components of the compressor have to heat up, it kind of creates a certain delay in the signal being processed. This actually exhibits a certain type of coloration or vintage vibe that you can't find in any other kind of compressor. The second type of compressor is called an optical compressor. These compressors affect the dynamic range of an incoming signal via a light element and optical cell. Put simply, the louder the sound gets, the brighter the light will get, which causes the optical cell to attenuate or compress the amplitude of the output signal. A good example of this is the LA2A classic leveling amplifier, which also uses tubes for its output gain. The third type of compressor found is called an FET, or field effect transistor. These compressors try and emulate the sound that a tube compressor will make by the use of transistor circuits. In other words, they use different components in order to have a similar sound that the tube compressor will have. However, they are a lot more cleaner, faster, and more reliable. A good example of this is the 1176 LN classic leveling amplifier. Now, the fourth type of compressor found is called a VCA, or voltage controlled amplifier. VCA compressors use something called a solid state or integrated circuit. Now an integrated circuit is basically a chip that can act as an amplifier, oscillator, timer, or microprocessor. In this instance, it is being used as an amplifier. Now, VCA compressors tend to be a lot cheaper than optical compressors or tube compressors, and also they tend to have less coloration. A good example is the DBX 160 compressor / limiter. Okay, so all of these compressors that I have spoken about are examples of hardware compressors. And like I said, plugin companies do try and emulate these compressors to give off the same kind of effect with their plugins. And I have to admit that I did get most of my information from the UAD website. I'll put a link in the description below for their website, and if you haven't checked it out already, please go take a look because they have some amazing products on offer. One of the coolest things when it comes to compression is the techniques used. There are 5 main types of techniques when compressing, and each have their own unique outcome and are used in certain situations. It's important to note that you will not always use a certain technique in a mixdown, so don't go and think that because you haven't used a certain technique that your mix isn't going to sound great. That comes down to you making the correct mixing choices. The most common technique used in compression is called downwards compression. Downwards compression is basically controlling and taming the transients and peaks of the sound, and also controlling the dynamic range. Second is sidechain compression. Sidechain compression is basically the same as downward compression, but instead you are taking an external signal and triggering the compressor off that. So when you have a bass and you want to sidechain it to a kick, you will put the kick as a sidechain, and every time the kick hits, the signal will be passed through the compressor, indicating the compressor to activate and compress the bass or whatever you're trying to sidechain to the kick. Next is multiband compression. Now, multiband compression is really interesting because it separates the frequency range of the sound into bands, where you can individually go in and control the dynamic range of the selected band or bands. This is very useful when you're trying to target a particular troubled area or a frequency within a sound. Fourth is my favorite type of technique, which is known as parallel compression or upwards compression, and is sometimes even known as New York compression. Now, this is done by having 2 compressors run in parallel to one another, one on the original sound and one on a bus channel. The one on the bus channel uses very harsh settings and is then blended in with the original compressed signal. This is done in order to boost the RMS range of the sound. To put simply, it just beefs up the low end of a sound. And lastly is something known as look-ahead compression. Now, look-ahead compression essentially analyzes the input signal and applies compression before the audio signal is heard. This is done in order to compress the transients in a very unique way and is very effective on sounds with a very sharp or fast transient. Well, that's it for the video. I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope you found it helpful. I'm thinking of doing a video series going into more detail on the compression techniques and when to apply them and how to apply them correctly. If this is something that you want to see, please leave a comment down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you want to see more of these videos, then please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video.